Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I want to take the opportunity to do a little bit of a mid-year check-in. Yes, I know it's August already and I'm a little bit behind schedule, but I wanted to take this opportunity to do a little bit of a mid-year check-in to talk about my numbers, where I am with reading, and how I feel like the rest of 2024 is going to go for reading. But I also want to take the opportunity to review what I've already read in 2024. I feel like because I read so many books and I talk about a lot of books, I very rarely revisit the good books that I read, in the sense that I may talk about it on my channel during that book review, or I may reference it in maybe a monthly wrap up, or when I talk about my favorite 5 stars. But a lot of these books I want to talk about a lot more than I actually do. So I'm going to take this 2024 mid-year review opportunity to also recommend a lot of books that I enjoyed from the first half of the year. And then if you are looking for reading inspiration from a wide variety of sources, genres, years, then I can maybe hopefully recommend some books that I've enjoyed in the first half of 2024. And always put how your year is going in the comment section down below. Do you feel like it's going well? What were your top reads of the year so far? I know we're a little bit past halfway, but I love these sort of review videos to look back at how much I've read and remember some of the great, fantastic books that I read in the first half of the year. So put your experience in the comment section down below. I love to receive them, and let's get started. So I do just have my reading challenge overview on Goodreads. Now I want to come off like right away and say that my numbers probably look pretty high. Keep in mind that I read a lot of manga. I also am in a very open period of my life, in the sense that I don't have kids, I don't even have a house, I'm not responsible for anything other than going to work, and I have a lot of free time right now, so I'm able to read a lot of the time. Now I also read quite consistently because I love reading. I usually read for the last hour or hour and a half before going to bed. I turn in pretty early because I'm a morning person, but I have a lot of other hobbies as well, so I do try to fit in reading, but just due to the nature of my life and how it looks right now, and due to the fact that I read a lot of manga, which can read quite quickly, especially if you get in a role or you just have a rainy afternoon where you can blow through 4 or 5 volumes, my numbers look really high. So do not compare you to me if you think your numbers are low. I don't care if your goal is 1 book a year, that's fantastic. People are reading, and I support everyone who is trying to read, whether you want to maintain the same level or maybe you have to back off your reading level just due to where you are in life. This is not to pressure you. I know some people feel pressure about these Goodreads goals. I just set them for me, and I know myself. I know that I read quite a large number due to manga. This is just a me thing. So with all those disclaimers out of the way, I've currently read 126 books this year out of my goal of 250. I don't think I'm going to hit my 250 goal, and I'll explain why a little bit later, but 126 feels pretty good. I know it says I'm 22 books behind schedule. I don't care. That's just Goodreads doing math. I don't care if I hit the 250. I do try to read 150 every single year, again, remembering that probably 75 of those books are going to be manga or comics, so those that read quite quickly. But 126 feels pretty good, and feels about accurate. 22 books behind schedule, I don't care about that. I've hit about 50% of my goal. You'll see here on the side that I read 272 last year. That was quite abnormal, and again was a lot of manga, so I hit it that year. But as you can see from previous years, I have not hit the goal before, so I'm not pressuring myself to hit that 250. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Oh well. So that's where I stand overall. Again, those numbers are because of manga, but I've also been in a couple series that revolve around medieval life and medieval manuscripts, and those books tend to be really interesting but art focused, and therefore tend to be about 60 to 100 pages, which I feel like also leads to a higher turnover of books. I've been reading a lot of books over the summer that are lighter and more fun. I just in the summer struggle to get into really deep, intense books because of the nature of summer. I want to be outside, I want to have fun, everything needs to be light and airy in my head, and I can dive into some heavier books. So the reason I think I'm not going to hit 250 books is because for the second half of the year, I know we're more than halfway through, but for the second half of the year, I definitely want to focus more on reading a couple areas. One, I want to continue reading Hugo Award winners and finalists. This is one of my personal, I would say lifelong goals almost, to read all of the Hugo Award winners and finalists in the novel and novella category. I'm having a lot of trouble finding some of the earlier books in the series, or like earlier books that were published in the 50s or 60s, just due to the nature of not a lot of libraries having them, but I want to focus on those. I also want to read down my TBR. My TBR is absolutely ridiculous. I do not read from my TBR. So if I go to my books, we'll see. I was going to go, here we go. If I look at my TBR, I just have them marked as want to read here. There's a lot. I have 232 and I would like to get this list under 100. The reason why this is so high is because I don't actually read from this list. So this is kind of a running list of things that I would like to read at some point that have seemed interesting for some reason at some point in my life. However, when I want to read, I don't just come to this list and pick something off it to read. I just reached for this list whenever I feel like something on this book is interesting. So this is more of a want to read list. And I have a second list, which is books that have been recommended in comments on YouTube videos. So overall, I have a lot of books to work through, and I haven't really looked at this list, but these are all ostensibly books I want to read. So I would like to start working through these because there's a lot of fascinating books that seem to be in here that I have been exposed to, and I want to start working through this, and eventually, I probably am not going to get this list under 100 by the end of the year, but I can at least work it down. I think I started the year at like 180, and we've made negative progress getting to 232, which is ridiculous. So, well, it's not. There's so many good books to read, so it makes sense that I'm adding books on here faster than I can read them, but I would like to at least make a dent and get this at least below 180 before the end of the year. There's also a lot of manga further down on this list, so there's some ones that I can knock out quite quickly, but yeah, I would like to focus on these. There are also some longer books that are that I want to read that are going to take a little bit more work to get through, so I think that's where a lot of my focus is going to be for the second half of the year. Now I want to go in and we're going to start going through some of my favorite books from the first half of the year. Now with 126 books, I'm not going to be able to talk about every book that I loved. I also tend to rate high. You'll notice my average rating for a year will be close to 4 stars, and that's because one, as I'm not old, okay? But I'm older. I'm not a teen. So I've read a large number of books in my life. I've always been a reader with the exception of the years I was in college. And so I tend to know pretty quickly. I'm willing to abandon a book is what I'm going to say. I feel like I can get a sense of whether or not I'm going to enjoy a book. And unless a book is a recommendation or for a book club, or I have some other reason for reading it, or if it's so bad it becomes entertaining, like that book about the woman who fell in love with the demon and she was like a cinnamon spice farmer. That was terrible, but really funny. Unless there's an ulterior motive to reading the book, I will usually just abandon a book. And sometimes I will also abandon a book if I intend to return to it, and that's how they wind up on this list over here. Maybe I start reading a book and I think this is fascinating, but I'm not feeling it right now. Maybe it's summer and I'm just not interested in being so serious in summer, or whatever the reason is. I will put it on this list to return to, so I'm very quick to abandon a book when I feel like it's going to be terrible. I don't push through books to read. I don't care. I don't have time for that. There's plenty of fascinating books in the world that I'm going to enjoy anyways, so why waste my time forcing myself through a book that isn't enjoyable? I also just ironically saw up here they're advertising romantasy, which is a genre I really dislike. So that's funny. Yay, okay. Let's go on to my 5 stars. This year I finished Haikyuu. I did not start Haikyuu in 2024, but I did finish it. Love it. Fantastic. I shouldn't have waited to read this series, but I did. It actually inspired me to get back into volleyball in real life. I played a little bit in elementary school and I didn't like it. Turns out I don't dislike volleyball. I dislike the team I played on because I've been playing in a rec league for a while now, and it was really fun. It's been fun. I love it. So I love this series. I thought it was so fun. It reintroduced me to a sport that I thought I didn't like, and I just really enjoyed the whole series. I don't know why the entry in Goodreads is in Japanese. I read it in English. I don't read or speak or understand Japanese. But Haikyuu, if you're looking for a sports manga series, this is obviously probably the most popular one. If you Google sports manga, it's going to come up. But yeah, I thought it was fantastic. I loved it. I don't think that's a controversial opinion. This also is what contributed to that massive number from last year, because I read like volumes 1 through 40 in 2023. So that's 40 books to my yearly goal that probably I read over the course of like 3 or 4 weeks. So in total read time. So this is how manga can quickly add up. I believe I read volumes 41 through 45 in 2024. Lake Superior Secrets. This was just a photography collection on Lake Superior, which is the largest Great Lakes. It's one that borders Canada and the United States. It is beautiful. It is massive. I actually had the opportunity to camp along Lake Superior earlier this year. And I think the author does a really good job of balancing the reflections that he has with the photography, and you can tell he gets a good sense. I also really like this book because I think that when authors or photographers write or discuss the Great Lakes, they're usually writing from an American perspective or a Canadian perspective, but he was able to get photographs and reflections on both sides of the border. Now, there is one, Lake Michigan, which is entirely within the United States, but all the other Great Lakes border Canada, so it's very noticeable when an author writes from one side or the other, or just photographs from one side or another, and I think this one was a really good balance of both. It was, like a photography collection, but I really enjoyed it. And only 4 ratings on Goodreads. Criminal. This was a good book. This is what I mean about wanting to get more, I don't know what you'd call it, hidden gems. Let me start closing these so it's less crazy. Next is another photography collection by Rebecca Bathory. This is Return to Fukushima. This was a photography collection in the exclusion zone around Fukushima. So Fukushima Daiichi was a nuclear plant which had a bit of a problem during a tsunami/earthquake in 2011. I think most of us remember that. And there is an exclusion zone around it. Now, I think they're starting to lighten up some of the zones around Fukushima, so I'm not entirely sure if this region is still blocked off. But Rebecca Bathory received permission to go in, and she decided to photograph this exclusion zone, which was quite touching. I don't want to say that Pripyat, which is the city, Pripyat, right? Which is the city around Chernobyl, has been over-photographed, but I think most of us are familiar with this story. Well, Fukushima just shows that a disaster like this is possible in our times, and also seeing a more modern version of destruction instead of, especially in the West, I feel like sometimes things that happen behind the Iron Curtain, like in the Soviet Union, might seem kind of like far away. Well, this feels like in the photography includes things like convenience stores, which we can all relate to. So I think it just had a little bit more of an emotional impact. Which is not to say that Chernobyl didn't have an emotional impact. I listened to Midnight at Chernobyl by Adam Higginbottom last year, I think it was, 2023. Phenomenal book, really showed some of the flaws and what led up to the problem. But this was just an interesting photography collection. I am deviating. I need to move faster. This is not controversial, okay? Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer. We see only has over 1 million ratings on Goodreads, so definitely not a hidden gem. But I finally got around to reading this one. This was an example of loving the book, but thinking the protagonist wasn't the wisest. I don't really know how old was he when Chris walked into the wilderness. I don't believe his prefrontal cortex was developed, and I think that shows. But this was a very, very interesting story, and I think if you haven't read it, you should. Most people are familiar with this book, so I'm going to move along because I don't need to redo it. This one is criminally underrated. Worlds Beyond Time, sci-fi art of the 1970s. I love sci-fi, and almost more than I love sci-fi, do I love sci-fi book covers. Phenomenal. Loved them. And this book is just a collection of the sci-fi art from the 1970s. Fantastic. It is criminal that it only has 110 ratings on Goodreads, which I know doesn't mean just 110 people read it, but 110 ratings on Goodreads. This was a fantastic book. If you're interested in sci-fi art, get this book, check it out. If you know someone in your life who likes sci-fi art, buy this for them for Christmas or their birthday. This is a book that I want a physical copy of, and I rarely do physical copies of books. I know I'm a library reader mostly, but this is one that I want to return to again and again. And the art from this, I still think about to this day. So it's fascinating, and yeah, I loved this one. This one, again, this is in Korean, and I'm not sure why the entry is in Korean because I didn't read the Korean copy. Again, I don't read, speak, or understand Korean. This is The Remarried Empress, which I believe was originally a webtoon or a webcomic. I'm loving this. This is about a woman who is in a political marriage in the sense that romance isn't the basis for their marriage, with a emperor, and the emperor decides to take on a mistress, which is allowed, but he there's this understanding that the emperor can take on a mistress, with the understanding that then the empress can take on someone on the side. Like, the idea is that their political union is what is most important, and they need to present a unified front to their kingdom. However, it's understood that there might not be romance between the two of them, so if they have their own private thing, that is considered acceptable. Of course, you shouldn't flaunt that in public. Basically, the emperor starts to flaunt a mistress and becomes very, very upset when the empress starts to receive attraction or attention from other men, and definitely setting up a double standard. The mistress is not at all likable. This was a really interesting series. I have not finished it. I don't think it's entirely been translated and put out. I'm not sure if the webtoon is done either, but I loved it. It is a romance, but I'm much more tolerant of romance in this manga, or would this be a manhwa because it's in Korean? I'm not sure what the correct terminology is. I'm much more forgiving of romance in this style, so loved it. I read through volume 5, but the library that I was getting these from does not seem to have volume 6, but I think volume 6 might be out. I'm not sure. I'm waiting for volume 6. I'm trying to find volume 6. Love this series. I highly recommend it if you're looking for a fantasy romance, and a really interesting romance, a really compelling romance, and what appears to be a slow burn romance. So I eat that stuff up. Next was a nonfiction book called Flatland by Edwin A. Abbott. So he was I believe he was a school teacher, or at least maybe he wasn't a school teacher, a theologian. I knew that. And this wasn't the book he was best known for in his lifetime, but it's been the one that's had the most enduring legacy. Abbott envisions a world that is entirely two-dimensional, with many characters living in a two-dimensional world. And then there is this individual in a two-dimensional world who suddenly gets raised up to the three-dimensional world, and everything is incomprehensible to him because he is so used to a two-dimensional world. Abbott builds out the laws and the customs and the structure of the two-dimensional world, and then has the world so well built out that as a reader you can understand the incomprehensibility of moving up to 3 dimensions, but also how the two-dimensional subject who is also brought into a one-dimensional world is unable to explain the world of 2 dimensions to a one-dimensional being. It seems very abstract, but it's very, very accessible, and it's fantastic, and it actually has a lot of connections with mathematical discoveries that came out in the 1900s. So I think Abbott was kind of ahead of his time, and he also does a really good job of explaining what sounds to be quite complex in a very interesting and accessible manner where you don't realize you're reading a math book. I see it's labeled as science fiction. I don't know if I would label it as science fiction, but it was definitely a fun read. I guess it is a masterpiece of science and mathematical fiction. I would call it mathematical fiction, but I guess it is science fiction. Check this one out. Next was Goblin Quest by Jim Hines. I actually listened to an audiobook of this in the spring, I believe it was. This is where a goblin gets captured by what is essentially a D&D party, and I think it's a very interesting twist on the usual adventurer fantasy story in which the adventurers are going in and the goblins are the bad guys. Instead, we just have goblins who are trying to live their life in peace in these caves, and we have these incursions of D&D parties, basically, who just wreak havoc and kill the goblins and are clearly the bad guys, which turns the trope, of course, if you play at a D&D table, of being the good D&D players coming in to save the day. I liked it. I liked the audiobook. It was like a, I'm gonna blank on this. It, like voice acting and sound effects and stuff. So it was well done. I liked it. I thought it was enjoyable. And it was the first in the series, but I haven't read anything else in the series. And this is by Jim C. Hines, who I have read stuff from before. I read the Terminal Alliance series, which is about an intergalactic janitor, which was quite interesting. I think his works are quite funny. I like Jim Hines' stuff. Next was My Pancreas Broke, But My Life Got Better by Kabi Nagata. Kabi Nagata is the author of a book that's much more popular called My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness. As we can see, this is number 6, but she's known for My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, which if you think you don't know it, yes you do. See if I can pull it up. Yeah, you've seen this one. My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness. But she wrote this one, which is a memoir, discussing her drinking problem, which developed after she wrote her first book to deal with maybe the pressure and also to reward herself for feeling like an adult, which quickly spiraled out of control into basically alcoholism and pancreatitis, which led to a hospitalization, which led to a lot of health complications. And she definitely is trying to battle this on her own while dealing with loneliness and the pressure of being popular, and also having written all this personal stuff and put it out in public, her changed relationship with her parents, who now have to kind of deal with the fact that their daughter's out there with all of this. It kind of all comes together, but I really appreciated the openness that the author had, and I felt like it would be very difficult to write this, but she also keeps a little line of humor throughout the whole thing. But it's definitely a serious topic, and I thought that it was, I don't want to say enjoyable to read, but I'm going to say important to read. 456 ratings only. I feel like there should be more. I have not read My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, though. Euler's Gem, The Polyhedron Formula and the Birth of Topology by David S. Richardson. Now, I want everyone, before you panic and skip 3 seconds ahead, I promise you this book is a fascinating, fascinating read. And no, it is still, it's not inaccessible to you because you quit taking math in 10th grade 3 decades ago. This book is, the author in the beginning of the book says if you want to understand this book, you can. If the author doesn't use anything doesn't start any of his topics with anything beyond a base level high school mathematic knowledge, and he keeps all of it, he builds on all of it so that you're never thrown into things. This is a book that introduces readers to the field of topology. Now, topology is, maybe we can think of it as a related topic to, I'm going to say geometry. I feel like that's not the right word, but I'm going to say geometry. It's the idea that if you had objects, but instead of being solid, they were made of rubber, what could you do to those objects, bending them and twisting them? Well, considering all the bending and twisting, but not tearing and cutting and gluing to be the same object. So it's different from our solid objects that we think of. It allows bending and twisting and other manipulations to be valid. It's an absolutely fascinating topic, and one that you're not exposed to in high school, and I was only briefly exposed to some topics from it in my college course, and I did receive my degree in math. So I want to learn more about this field. I've been meaning to for a while, but summer hit and I had other things I wanted to do besides sit and slide all summer with a math textbook. So I think that's going to be a winter activity, discovering topology, but this was a fantastic book to start with, and I promise you it's interesting. I feel like one of those scammy influencers who is like, I promise this face serum's gonna change your life, and it's just some like BS Amazon link. I actually promise this is a fascinating introduction to the field of topology. I would recommend looking up topology or a brief introduction to topology online just to see if that's a topic you want to read, and if it is, this is the book to go. I've read a couple other books on topology this year or in the last couple years, and this is by far the best one. I feel like I rated it 4 stars. Something else about returning to books after I've read them, I may find that the rating has been revised. I would probably give this a 5-star at this point. My rating at Goodreads is just my initial first impression, and it definitely fluctuates after the fact, but Goodreads is mostly just like a catalog or a list of books I've read. I do not care about maintaining the perfect rating or writing reviews or anything like that. It's just to keep track of what I've read. A Stroke of the Pen by Terry Pratchett. So this book is actually the work of some people who were doing some work in archives after Terry Pratchett's death. So Terry Pratchett passed away in, I believe, 2015? Yes. He passed away in 2015. He's most known for his Discworld series, which is a fantastic fantasy series, which is in and of itself 5-star reads all around. But before he wrote Discworld, he wrote a lot of short stories under pen names that were not fully attributed to him. And while working in some archives, some individuals were able to track some books, or some short stories written under a alternative name to Terry Pratchett. And these are collected in this book. So they are written by Terry Pratchett, but Terry Pratchett has sadly passed away, so he did not write this book in the year of our Lord 2024 or 2023. Instead, this is a collection which is an effort to find works that had previously not been attributed to him, but that he wrote, and put them together. I think what's most interesting about this book, let me back up. This book is going to be most interesting to people who are familiar with his Discworld series, because I feel like I can see the beginning of his humor style, his writing, and the nebulous beginnings of some things that are going to be included in the Discworld series before they actually get formalized in the series he's best known for. If you're not familiar with him, it's just going to be a little humorous collection of short stories, but that's about it. I think it's most impactful for people who have read Terry Pratchett. I have read Terry Pratchett. I love Terry Pratchett. I love his works. So this was a fantastic and interesting book for me to read. Mathematics for Human Flourishing by Francis Su. There's also a sections in here written by Christopher Jackson, who was currently, at this time, I'm not sure if he still is, serving time in a federal prison somewhere for some crimes. So Mathematics for Human Flourishing, and that is handy. I mean, that's relevant. Mathematics for Human Flourishing by Francis Su is an appeal for the purpose of studying mathematics for all of us. I felt like it was quite good. I enjoyed it, and I really liked that he was including this stuff from Christopher Jackson, who was a man who made some unfortunate decisions early in his life, and however, just while in prison, decided to improve his life, and one of the things he got interested in is studying mathematics, and he was able to do things like correspondence courses and self-studying and talk to Francis Su to improve his studying that he was doing in prison. And I think it just shows that we are fortunate enough to live, this one took place in the United States, that if you want to improve your life, even if you're in a place like prison, you can, if you would like to. And I really appreciated his insights and the self-study experiment, and the fact that he's in a quite difficult position in prison, and yet was able to do a lot of the self-study. I do not know when he was going to be released. I think he had a 20-year sentence. I don't know if it says anywhere. They were Christopher's letters who are throughout here. Christopher Jackson, who discovered mathematics as an inmate in the federal prison. So, yeah, there we go. The Cancer Factory by Jim Morris. So I feel like this is a companion book to Soul Full of Coal Dust, which is a book discussing the workers in coal mines in Appalachia who got black lung, and then the working of the companies to avoid paying out any sort of black lung benefits to those workers by claiming that their black lung came from other things like smoking outside of work. And all the shady practices that were done to hide the dangerous working conditions, dangerous for the lungs at least, working conditions in the mines. That was Soul Full of Coal Dust. Cancer Factory felt very, very similar on a lot of regards, up to the point where the tactics lawyers were using from the companies were the same. So really read both of these in tandem, because I feel like there's a lot of overlap, at least in the behavior of the companies. Cancer Factory is about Goodyear Tire and Rubber, who were exposed to some chemicals, orthotoluidine in particular, which gave them bladder cancer at a very, very high rate. And the company was not really interested in accepting blame or understanding that they were being exposed to toxic chemicals. Now, of course, with any sort of thing that's toxic, there is some forgiveness for a period of time in which maybe a company truly does not know the danger that they're exposing their workers to. And there was times throughout this book where workers truly didn't understand the seriousness, but at some point, the companies, and this goes for the coal mining companies too, understood that what they were exposing their workers to probably had negative effects, and that's where I believe the unethical actions come in, where they refuse to take any sort of preventative measures to help their workers. Not saying they can't even work with that chemical, but what can you do to prevent them from getting bladder cancer? Instead, I think a lot of them were treated as disposable. We'll find someone else to replace you when you go down with bladder cancer. And there's a lot of interviews in here with wives, men who have bladder cancer, and the toll it takes. And the toll extended beyond just the men who worked in the factory, but also included things like birth defects from their children, which led to a lot of loss of life and other tragic situations. So, a moving story, but I felt like there was a lot of overlap with other books that I've read as well. Again, I don't want to say, oh, this was a great read. This was an interesting read. But it was interesting, in not like the way a fantasy book is interesting. Interesting in a sense that important. Here's another one that I think wasn't interesting, but was important. It was interesting too, but again, not the way that a fantasy book is interesting. Failure of Justice, a brutal murder, an obsessed cop, and 6 wrongful convictions. So there was a small Nebraska town where a woman was murdered, a woman who had no, and quite violently murdered. assaulted and murdered, and she had no connection to crime. She was just an older woman who was living by herself in an apartment, no known enemies, not mixed up with anything. It was very unclear what had happened. And this book outlines how a man with a single-minded mission who lacked proper authority was able to obtain false confessions from people by putting them under psychological duress. People who were later cleared with DNA evidence. In some cases, all of them spent time in prison, significant amount of time in prison, and one of them had actually died. So this was actually a case in which courts were wound up having to pay out like restitution payments and had to pay out to the victims of these false convictions, who suffered for years. And the person who was proven to be a perpetrator of the crime, who's actually initially on the police radar but was scratched due to poor policing, passed away before he had to face justice for his actions. This is the book that can kind of show you that when you have someone who already has a story, will hammer the facts to fit the story. They will twist the facts, and how when placed under sufficient psychological duress, especially when the duress is threatening people with the death sentence if they don't confess, can lead to false confessions from people who did not commit the crime. So this was a very, very interesting book, but again, interesting in the thought-provoking manner. Maybe I should start using the word thought-provoking. It's thought-provoking. It was not interesting in the sense that a fantasy book is interesting. It's always interesting to talk about books, because a few books ago I was talking about a Terry Pratchett book, and now I'm talking about a rather serious book. And both of them were, in my mind, like books that were very interesting, but they're good in different senses of the word. They're different purposes. I'm blathering on at this point. And now we're moving on to something that's totally different. I feel like I maybe should have grouped these better to prevent tonal shifts. Dinosaur Art 2, Because I'm a Child, Steve White. This is a collection, a big hardcover collection of paleo art. Fantastic. I had a fun time looking through this. It featured about 10 artists. Oh, right there, 10 amazing artists. And was super fun to read and flip through because I'm a child. I think I read it 3 times before I returned it to the library. I loved it. There's also interviews with the artist, which is also really interesting. Okay, I believe there's 2 books. Oh, there is. There is 2 books on Shin-Hanga that I read, so I guess I'm going to do both now. Shin-Hanga was a print movement in Japan in the early 1900s that was kind of dismissed for the first half of the 1900s, but then started to get the recognition that it deserved. I love Japanese woodblock prints, particularly of the ukiyo-e style, but this is one that I was introduced to and I really, really enjoyed. So I got a couple books and read a couple books on it and loved it. So, excuse me. Yeah, Shin-Hanga. This is one called New Prints in Modern Japan. The other one is called The New Print Movement of Japan, so a little different. I think this Shin-Hanga book by Kendall Brown and Hollis Goodall-Christant had really good text to accompany it, but I felt like at times the pictures included were too small. Well, Shin-Hanga had the good full-size pictures, so I think these together made a really fantastic pairing. That's what I would say about them. Get both of these if you're looking for my recommendation, so you can have both side by side to learn about that art movement in Japan. This is one of those medieval series I was talking about that I've been reading and have pushed up that book number. I don't read smaller books for the sole purpose of pushing up my yearly book numbers. I do not care about my Goodreads goal that much. It's just a meaningless number on a screen that I set for myself. But this series has been fantastic. They're about 100 pages long, and they deal primarily with medieval art, and they take a topic, in this case, Faces of Power and Piety, so saints and parts of the clergy and the Pope, and talk depictions of God and biblical scenes, and talk about how these tied in with medieval art. Fantastic. Love this series. I think the art's great, the context is great, the people they get to write these books are great. It's the Medieval Imagination series. So if we open up this series, We can see I've read everything in the series, and honestly, I would recommend all of these in the series. We have Images in the Margin, Faces of Power and Piety, Building the Medieval World, and Beasts, Factual and Fantastic. I love this series. Magic in Medieval Manuscripts. This is part of another series that I am reading, which I'll open up here. This is by Sophie Page. So this is just another series that is quite short. We see this one was 65 pages. They take a topic, they look at it and how it relates to manuscripts, and they write about it. Again, because it's so short, you're getting a high level view, but I feel like it's designed to be high level so you can choose what you want to study in depth. We can see from the series I've also read Astrology in Medieval Manuscripts, The Magic in Medieval Manuscripts, and Monsters and Grotesques in Medieval Manuscripts, and I've enjoyed these from the series as well. The nocebo effect, when words make you sick. So many of us are familiar with the placebo effect, but the nocebo effect is the opposite. So the placebo effect is when you maybe feel relief from something that isn't actually helpful. So for example, if you're in a drug like a clinical drug trial, and you receive the sugar pill, but you experience relief of your symptoms, that's kind of expected that a certain percentage of the sugar pill group will experience relief of the symptoms because we expect this placebo effect. By thinking you are taking medication, you may experience a positive benefit from that belief that you're taking the medication. However, there's the opposite, the evil twin. Says right here, placebo's evil twin, the nocebo effect, which is when words can make you sick. By believing you're going to experience side effects from a medication, you may actually experience more side effects from the medication. A very, very interesting look at the nocebo effect. Very brief, 229 pages, but it read pretty quickly. So definitely not in-depth and quite accessible to someone without a medical background like myself. Legends of the Nahanni Valley by Hammerson Peters. I was looking for a book that discussed myths and legends of northern Canada, and this book fit the bill, despite being a book that was self-published or published under a very small publishing company run by this guy, so self-published. I think that this book did a fantastic job of collecting all of these niche legends and myths from this northern region of Northwest Territories, and put it together in a book that, despite being a little under 500 pages, was so fascinating and I devoured from beginning to end. Absolutely fantastic. If you're interested in myth, legends, and lore, and this includes historical events too, from both the native people who lived there and also the gold prospectors who came in the 1800s, this is a fantastic book. I really recommend it. I feel like there's not a lot of books that cover topics like this on the market. I actually had to recommend it to be purchased by my library to even get my hands on this, but I do see it's available for quite an affordable price on Kindle. So if you're looking to learn about Canadian myths and legends, especially from northern Canada, this could be a fantastic book and I highly recommend it. The Sunset Years of Agnes Sharp by Leonie Swan. This was a book that I believe was originally published in German, but it takes place in England, in the English countryside, and we have some older inhabitants who are choosing to do like a group living situation as they live out their sunset years. However, they have studied under, I was reading this down here, I saw this, so I just started saying what I was reading. Agnes has stumbled across a murder, and so she and her other inhabitants, who are these older individuals who live together, have to solve the murder mystery. I love this book. I wouldn't quite say it's cozy mystery, although it's marked as cozy mystery. It is not incredibly violent, and the twist was interesting, so if you're looking for a mystery, check this one out. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's entirely cozy mystery, but it's a little mystery. It's a mystery, just not a cozy mystery in my mind. Town of Evening Calm, Country of Cherry Blossom by Fumio Kuno. Fumio Kuno, I've read other books by her, and all the books I've read from her focus on World War II and post-war Japan. So when there's war, civilians usually wind up paying the price of the decisions of different governments. And in this case, we follow post-war Japan and the fallout, both literal and figurative, of the bombing of Hiroshima. So the fallout in the sense of the people who got sick, but also the people who lost family, people who lost whole groups of family, and people who are just trying to pick up the pieces of life and continue on. So this takes place over 3 generations. It's a manga. I loved it. It wasn't quite as long as the other book I read by her. Let me see. There was a really, really long one which took place over, I'm blanking on the name, which took place over World War II, which was like 500 pages. So this one is much shorter if you're looking to get into Fumio Kuno. In This Corner of the World. This is another one that took place during World War II. However, this one was quite a bit longer. Well, the Town of Evening Calm, Country of Cherry Blossoms was shorter and more accessible, while still really conveying an emotional punch. Next up is The God's Lie by Kaori Ozaki. This one was a standalone manga, which I'm really trying to read more of. When I start series, even if they're great, I feel like I'm locked in and that I'm going to be on the hook for many, many series. I'm still reading Komi Can't Communicate. I'm trying to get my hands on the next book in the series. No matter how I look at it, it's You Guys Fault Not Popular. You're going to see I started the series Ennead. I've also been reading the Correspondence from the End of the Universe. I get sucked into a lot of manga series and I need to stop. I need to do some more of these standalone series. So this is a standalone about a friendship which blossoms between a boy and a girl over the summer, and the girl is definitely hiding some things about her home situation, and it's kind of one of those, like, I don't want to say quite coming of age, but almost the first summer for the boy when he starts to grow up. I'm not phrasing this quite well, but it's kind of a pivotal summer for the boy, and you start to understand that as he interacts with this girl who's hiding things about her family. If you're looking for a standalone manga series, see, I say manga and I immediately want to say series because I read so many. If you're looking for a standalone manga, this is a fantastic one to read. It says here romance, but they're in 6th grade, so romance, first love. Here's another one in that medieval imagination series, Beasts, Factual and Fantastic by Elizabeth Morrison. Again, a look at the manuscripts from this J. Paul Getty Museum and British Library, and then specifically looking at the beasts. So if you will like medieval art, this is a fantastic book. Just a little over 100 pages, so reads quickly, but enjoyable. The Unstrung Harp by Edward Gorey. This was a hidden gem that I found just wandering my library stacks. This is about an author who's writing a novel, which is almost a frame within the frame tale of the real author, Edward Gorey, writing The Unstrung Harp. It takes place over the course of a year and follows an author named Mr. Earbrass, who's going to write a novel, and this is quite fine literature that he's going to be writing, and he has his methods, and is in a almost graphic novel / comic format, which feels very unusual because it was published in the early 1950s. This book is one of those books that I feel like really encapsulates the fact that when we have I'm going to say a culture, as though I can speak of a culture, but when a lot of book review now takes place online in either YouTube videos, but I also know spaces on TikTok are quite popular for reviewing books as well. I'm not on TikTok, so I can't really speak to that, but I do see all the videos. And a big focus whenever we have these online books, and this goes not just for books, but any sort of product, makeup, clothing, fashion, music, is there's always the new thing that you have to keep up on. And when we're always keeping up on the new releases pertaining to books, when we're always thinking, oh, what book was released? What are the new releases? What's hot now? We have these books that are older. Even a book that's 10 or 15 years old starts to become forgotten and not checked out as much, even if it's really great. And that's kind of the danger of only looking at what's popular or what's hot now, is you kind of lose these many, many decades of fantastic books that have been written. And if it's not old enough to kind of reach classic status, or it's not popular enough to have reached classic status, then it kind of languishes on library shelves like The Unstrung Harp did, where it's not quite popular enough to get critical acclaim and become a classic, but it's old enough to not be remembered. And this was a fantastically funny book. Someone said here it's a small masterpiece, and I agree with it. It's a little over 50 pages. Check this one out. Don't let this hidden gem languish in your library shelves. Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams by Matthew Walker. I initially heard Matthew Walker talk on a podcast that I sometimes listen to, the Andrew Huberman podcast, or it's like Huberman Labs podcast or something. And I was absolutely fascinated with the way he described sleep. I'm a big proponent of sleep. I get my 8 hours every single night. I go to bed at the same time. I wake up at the same time. I feel fantastic. And this book just kind of gave me the ammunition to understand exactly why I feel that way, because sleep is so important to our well-being, and it's something that we usually abuse in our society. And admittedly, I also have abused sleep at points. You know, who hasn't pulled an all-nighter in college to get stuff done, even though you felt horrible the next day? This was a fantastic look at sleep, enjoyable, loved it. Definitely not a hidden gem as it has over 100,000 ratings, but if you wanted to learn more about the biology of sleep, this was a very accessible, interesting, good book. At one point they were feeding drugs to spiders, so that was really interesting, but there's a lot going on in this book, and I recommend checking it out. Next, A Letter to the Luminous Deep by Sylvie Cathrall. This is a book that is written entirely in letter format. The letters are being pieced together by two survivors of an accident. The people who are left behind after an accident. So there is a girl named E who began a letter correspondence with a scholar named Henry. And they are writing letters because E saw something mysterious and she's hoping that the scholar can help. They live in an entirely water-filled world, so some of them are underwater, some of them are floating above water, and they write letters. However, they begin to uncover a mystery, and E and Henry go to explore, and they disappear, presumed dead. So as we see here, a year later, E's sister Sophie and Henry's brother Viren are left to solve Viren? I didn't know how to say his name, are left to solve the mystery of their disappearance. So they're reading these letters and trying to piece together what happened, as they also discover the mystery that Henry and E had discovered. It is entirely in letter format. I loved it. I thought it was funny. I thought it was charming. I'm surprised that it only has a 3.69 on Goodreads, but people are entitled to their opinion. I really enjoyed it. I think it took a while to get started, so there was some confusion for me at the beginning, and at first I was like, I don't know if I'm going to like it, but it became a 5-star read. It also is marked as a romance, but I'm finding that I enjoy romance more when it's kind of slow burn or not like Pure Spice. You know what I'm talking about. Like, this is entirely through letters, and it's very, like, I don't want to say formal, but it is kind of formal, and I really, really liked it. And I find that I don't mind romance in a book when it's not the only thing that's going on. There is an overarching mystery that's taking precedence, as well as this beautiful world building that's happening. So the romance is kind of a B plot, and when the romance is a B plot, and the second thing, I'm rooting for both of the characters, then I'm on board. I think nothing annoys me more than a romance where I don't feel on board with the characters, and yet I'm having to read about it. That's my main problem with romance, is when it's the only plot, because I feel like I know what's going to happen, so I don't really care about reading it. And 2, when I feel like the characters either naturally don't have that chemistry, it hasn't been built, when the romance is not love but lust, and it's being passed off as we're supposed to believe it to be love, or when the romance is happening way too quickly, which kind of goes in with the second point. So I feel like this is one where the romance B-plot was done well enough, so I was really on board with it, which is surprising because I'm very picky with romance. It is a fantasy romance, but I wouldn't say personally this is romantasy. Yeah. What did I do? Oh, this is how people have shelved it. Okay, we're done with this though. Inanna, Lady of the Largest Heart. This is actually a very interesting collection of poems that have been discovered from ancient Sumer. These were presumably written by Enheduanna, which is how I'm pronouncing this name, who was a high priestess. She was actually the high priestess of a different god, Nanna, and she was placed in that role by her father, Sargon, I believe he was Sargon, I think. Maybe I'm just making that up. But she was placed in the role by her father. I'm not making that up. I don't quite remember her father's name. As a political move, and she was believed to have written these hymns of praise to Inanna, who is a goddess who's also associated with some of the female goddesses that we understand and are more familiar from Mesopotamia. I liked this because I felt like the other author, the person who put this together, Bede de Shong Mater, this woman right here, did a really good job of adding explanatory text before the poem. So she would explain what we were going to be reading. Then we would actually see the translation that she had done of the poetry, and then we would have an analysis of what we had read. And I felt like all of that, the sandwiching of the poem between some introduction and explanation made it feel accessible, not like something I wasn't understanding, but also the poetry and the translation of itself also felt quite accessible. So it felt like it wasn't this distant thing written a long time ago. It felt very fresh and modern. I do think at times the author got a little teary-eyed, misty-eyed, that's what I'm looking for, about the good old days where the goddess was in charge. I feel like sometimes she was a little bit more close on that side. Also, I'm noticing right now it says it was published January 1st, 2271, which is not true. But overall, I think it was fantastic. I'm really glad that I read that. And the final 5-star, or these aren't all 5-star, but the final top book I'm going to review is Ennead, Volume 1. This is by Mojito. This is a graphic novel of Egyptian mythology. It is labeled as boys' love, and I'm not sure where that comes in. I have a hold on Volume 2, but if you want a webcomic, graphic novel, manga of Egyptian mythology, this is a fantastic book for you to check out. I see that this entry is in what appears to be Italian. I didn't read it in Italian, I read it in English. I don't know what Goodreads is on. So those were some of the top recommendations that I read in the first half of the year out of the 126 books I have read so far. However, if you want to get more detail on any of these books, I'm going to leave a comment in the comment section that lists all of the links to the books that I have mentioned, so you can check out the reviews that I have done on my channel and see which ones are more interesting for you. And as always, I want to see what you're reading. I love to hear what other people are reading. Please, please, please leave your comments and let me know, and hopefully I'm able to stay on track and get lots more reading and have so many more 5-star reviews in the second half of the year, so I'm able to do a end of year wrap up where I discuss my favorites and hopefully have many, many more books to share. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.